What I mean. Putting on a school play or smooching with a girl behind the curtains, laughing up your sleeve at a foolish teacher, these things are hardly the domain of the rich. Besides, there's something quite invigorating about growing up under a rigid system of rules. It makes kids secure in an odd way. They know where the rules are, but it also gives them a structure against which to test themselves. It gives them rules to bend and to break and things to get around. And getting around things, well, finding a way to get your own way is one of the great thrills of growing up. All right, no more sermonizing. Now with me is James FitzGerald, the author of Old Boys, the powerful legacy of Upper Canada College. Hi, James.
Hi, David.
And I'm not going to be coy about this. James and I not only went to the same school, but we were also in the same class. I think it was grade 11, wasn't it?
That's
yes,
right.
We sat at the back of the class. Now, James, this point, this rather long-winded point I just made about the joy of breaking rules. When you were interviewing all these guys from Upper Canada, did that come up, that pleasure of breaking these rigid rules?
All the time. One old boy put it, he defined himself against the rules. His whole personality is, in fact, formed by it. And, I mean, you get varying degrees of severity in terms of what happened to them given the time period. Of course, in the old days, they would beat you physically.
Right.
And our year was just starting
Made
to
us the
stop.
men we are,
Yeah,
James.
exactly.
It made us the men we are. Nothing that a good thrashing won't cure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but there were actually, but it's true, there were these sort of punishments, sort of starting
That's
off
right.
with detentions and going up to sort of capital punishment.
That's right. And, I mean, the caning stopped maybe the early 70s, but certainly, and we were at the end of that era, but you knew that, and that really made you think
Right.
twice. And
Right.
so you've got interesting responses to that. You get a spectacular case like Conrad Black, or Canada's own international capitalist.
Yeah, and of course not even a Canadian anymore.
That's right, Lord Black now. And he's an interesting case because he's so identified with the British public school system and the British, Anglophilia.
Right.
And remarkable.
But he was a private school boy.
From age of 7, and remarkably very defiant. And they caned him at age 8, 9, and 10. And as I was interviewing him, I was quite sympathetic. I mean, he's kind of a scary guy, a bit Darth Vader-ish, but I was actually listening to him, and I became, this is quite impressive actually, in the 50s, age 9 and 10, defying these men with large sticks.
A very ballsy guy, and he did some naughty stuff, didn't he?
And the more they beat him, the more he defied them, and then the more they beat him.
Right.
And no one else did that in his peer group. And so by the time of age 14, as he said, his final act of defiance was to actually steal the exams and make copies and sell them to his classmates for a profit.
Right.
A young entrepreneur makes good.
Right. Right.
And to this day, he won't got back to the school, and he's still defiant.
So, did you discover that when you were talking to these guys that sort of this independent spirit was something that schools like that actually did nurture?
In certain personalities. I mean, that was the split. You saw examples like Black, who did become enormously self-confident for some reason,
Yeah.
and others who were absolutely crushed by it. It's not so far to say destroyed.
Yeah, but James, I've had the, during the 60s it was very fashionable to loathe private schools, and a lot of us kind of grew our hair and put on John Lennon glasses and went down to Yorkville, while our parents were picking up the tab, I might add, and fought against the system. But it did strike me that the boys who were destroyed by private schools were perhaps boys who might have been destroyed by any institution.
Predisposed to
that?
be, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, the tragedy at Columbine, for example. I mean, it seems to me that there are certain children in this world who just have a very hard time of it, and they're going to have a very hard time of it anywhere.
Yeah.
Do you think? I mean, let's talk about the downsides. What you really think are the downsides of a private school education? What do you think they are, really?
Yeah. Well, again, from that era, talking to these old boys, what struck me was the intensity of feelings. I mean, I just took a very simple approach. I put down a tape recorder and I said, talk to me.
Right.
And it did kind of create a kind of cathartic experience for a lot of people. I didn't intend to get that necessarily. I didn't always get that. But when it happened, it was amazing.
And one of the things is that a lot of these guys were seriously still pissed off.
Oh, decades afterwards.
And about what?
Well, again, this is where it's complex. The school is unique, I think, in the sense of, just because of the concentration of wealth and power in the country in one place. And you had not only school expectation, but family expectations. So you had a lot of pressure on some kids this was not true of all of us. But, I mean, a good example is David Thompson, who's the grandson of Lord Roy Thompson of Fleet, the media baron.
Right.
He's in line to inherit $16 billion. I mean, that's
$16 billion with a B?
$16 billion.
That's a lot of bananas.
Yeah, the 10th largest family fortune in the world. And he actually talked to me, which amazed me because he never talks to the press. And his was a good example of, here is a sensitive, artistic boy inheriting this fortune. And he was amazingly frank with me, and he said that he was an isolated person, he had no friends, and he tells the story of going to the school, the prep school at age 7 on his bicycle on the first day, and a little boy comes up beside him and says, "My mother's thrilled that we're going to be in the same class together because you're going to be able to help me later on in life." And he said he didn't twig until he was about 30 that he said, "Oh, I see. This is what this is about.
Right.
That this is the only reason a boy would want to be with me." And he was remarkably frank about this, that he actually said,
Now, one of the, I'm not sure if it's a mythology, one of the characteristics that almost all boys who went to private schools here, England, Germany, France, certainly in the 60s and 70s, they all talk that homosexuality and sexual abuse was a given at a school like that. How much of that is a mythology, and how much of that did you discover in your interviews was actually true?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely true. I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon because you remember in our time, there maybe was a faculty of maybe 40, and I think at least maybe a third or a quarter of them were gay.
Right.
And the word gay didn't exist then.
Right.
And they were closeted.
Right, but that's not to say that those guys who were third were jumping in the sack with borders.
And that's the thing. I think part of my own education was I learned at a quite early age, an impressionable age, the subtleties and nuances of that. Like my best teacher was gay, and my worst teacher was gay, and they were like anybody else.
Right.
At the same time, you saw these, in some cases, sort of alcoholic, self-loathing characters who you felt a degree of sympathy for.
Right.
And this is in the 60s, remember? And this was before people came out. And you sort of wish that they would. You know, it's okay.
Now, I know that there are certain cases before the courts right now, so we can't really discuss them, but is it safe to say that there were cases of sexual abuse on an ongoing basis?
Yes.
It was part of the private school
It's in my
experience?
book. There's several mentions of it in my book, and there was a case, a master did plead guilty in '98 for raping a boy, and as you say, there's other cases before the courts now, and I think it's the timing. I mean, we're just talking 20 years ago now.
Right.
It's now starting to come out, but it was in my own interviews, it was implicitly there. But again, you have to almost talk by a case-by-case basis because there's remarkable contradictions and subtleties in them. For example, a boy said, "I was 16 and I seduced my 45-year-old Latin teacher one day."
Well,
and he said that was a victimless situation, and that's against the law technically, but so what?
Right, right.
So it would get all kinds of variations.
Yes, exactly. That it's important to remember that a number of these students were actually practicing gays when they were having relationships with teachers. So it wasn't a completely predatory situation.
That's right.
Let's talk about the upsides of a private school education, apart from the fact that, well, you and I turned out we're exemplars of reasons not to send your children to a private school. But all kidding aside, what do you think in your travels did you discover? What are the upsides of this rather, I think it is a specialized form of education.
That's
all guys, lots of money.
Yeah.
What were some of the upsides?
Well, there is in a sense, they don't advertise themselves this way, but what's implicit, I think, is it's the ready-made network is kind of what you're buying into, particularly for first-generation Canadians.
How do you mean?
You can buy your way in. For example, recent immigrants are very attracted to the school because it's kind of a ticket to the upper middle class. I mean, you get in, you work hard, scrape together the money, get $17,000 to pay for your son to go here, and if he makes it, I mean, he's going to go off to Harvard or Yale, and he's going to have this network of friends, and you're in.
Right,
and
but I'm not, James, with all respect, I'm not sure that, getting into the Canadian middle class is the summum bonum of all human experience.
For some people it is.
To tell you the truth. But between you and me, as guys, personally, what upsides do you think there are to a private school?
Okay, well...
Or do you think there are any? Maybe you think there's...
Yeah, no, there's a real paradox in that. There are upsides and downsides, and they're almost fused together, and it's hard to separate them sometimes.
Sure.
But certainly, I think, get a good, solid education, a rigorous education that now people are bemoaning no one gets anymore.
Right.
There's an element of truth to that.
Right.
Then the question becomes at what cost, of course, not financially or emotionally.
Right.
And there's a lot to be said for that. And a lot of people in my book are very grateful for that grounding, and a good example is Michael McMillan, who founded Atlantis Films. He started playing, a teacher gave him a Super 8 camera in grade 7,
This is at Upper Canada.
And it just took off, and he just loved it, and he became in love with films. He's been eternally grateful to the school ever since. And there's all kinds of examples of that.
Yes, a lot of the, you know, a lot of the private school boys that I've encountered over the years, sure, a lot of them, you know, bitch about that it was oppressive, that it was suffocating, but they did learn their Latin conjugations and declensions.
Yes.
No, but they actually can write a sentence, and I'm not making a defense here, but it is something that does come up again and again too. What about the issue of, James, as I get older, my appreciation for good manners increases a great deal. There is a feeling that schools like that, for whatever reason, engender good manners in kids. What do you think? Do you think that that is true? Is that something that people said to you during your interviews?
Yeah, I wonder about that. Again, in some cases, I suppose. I mean, there's the much vaunted polite Canadian personality. Maybe something to do with being Canadian. Another guy in my book said most Upper Canada college old boys, if they were invited to an Italian upper-class gathering, they'd be laughed out for being crass and boor and not knowing how to hold their cutlery. And, you know,
really?
that would be the European sensibility versus the North American. And I think there's some degree of truth. I mean, there's a lot of boorishness, too. I mean, it was politeness, but incredible crassness and boorishness among some of these people. I mean,
right. There's also the myth, too, that I remember, which was, and one hears that you have to be inordinately rich to go to one of these schools. That's not really the case.
Again, one of the myths, maybe. It certainly is a school for the, if you want to call it ruling elite or plutocracy, and the Eatons and Bassetts and all the wealthy families who sent their kids there for generations. But then there's this large segment of, most recently, Hong Kong immigrants sending their kids there.
Right.
And middle-class people struggling to get the money together. They can't, they're not wealthy, but they work hard. They might be teachers or doctors or whatever, and they send their kids there.
You know, I didn't have I didn't get a job, my first job, till I was 30, and I only got one then because my wife gave it to me. But I've heard that private school guys get job opportunities more readily than other people do. Now, nobody has ever offered me a job at anything. But is this true? Is this a part of the
again, I think it depends on the professions. I heard all kinds of stories, particularly law and Bay Street.
Right.
Like that was really what the school was created for initially. Was you get stockbrokers, businnesmen, lawyers. And if they would go in for the interview as a young law student, and they'd, oh, you went to Upper Canada, oh, what house were you in, oh, they'd have a connection. And the number of people that said that that was an in, just unquestionably. It may be less so now, but certainly historically, that's the way it worked.
Now, we've got a few minutes left, so James, let me have your own thoughts, and you back it up with an anecdote if you're so inclined. You know, you're my age. Would you send your son to a private school if you could?
If I could, if I had
you
the
had
money.
the cash, right? Let's say you have the cash, it's done.
Yeah.
Would you do it as the kind of experience which you think is good for the forming of a young person's character?
Yes, again, with many qualifications. I would insist it be co-ed. Upper Canada's not. I know the irony is Upper Canada produced a lot of people who went on to become headmasters of other private schools. There's about 6 of them.
Oh, really?
And the first thing they did when they left, they're our vintage, they made them co-ed. I mean, that's the intense feeling was, we have to have girls here. And that's a controversial issue, I know, but...
Yeah, let me ask you about that. Why do people feel like private schools would be better if they were co-ed? What's wrong with the school just for boys?
Well, there's an argument there would be less abuse, that women have a civilizing effect on these young savages, and it would be less Lord of the Flies kind of situation.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know, that's one argument. The problem with what's really interesting is the ECC doesn't even engage in the argument. I mean, they're so fundamentally married to this idea of boys only, and they're fiercely so. And I find that very interesting. You don't even talk about it.
Right.
Now, that in itself is intriguing.
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of fascinating arguments for and against it, and I heard them all when I interviewed these people.
Right.
And, but isn't that remarkable? In the year 2001, it's a taboo subject.
Absolutely. James, this is a lovely book. I've read this book. It's called Old Boys by James FitzGerald, and it's the best gloves off record I've ever read in my life of the experience of actually going to a private school. James, thank you very, very much for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Okay. When we come back, more private school scum. I don't mean that. John Cleese. John Cleese is a private school boy, and we're going to have a look at him and his early days as a private school guy. Okay, see you in a bit.